Someone once said New York was such a beautiful city, they had to name it twice. That's why many here refer to it simply as New York, New York, or the Big Apple. But now Dong was asking about this. Why do they call it the Big Apple? Well, because apple trees used to grow there once upon a time. But that's a story for another day. The truth is, the entire island, which is 12 miles long, is called New York City, consisting of 5 boroughs or neighborhoods, including Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, all part of New York City, and all combined to form part of one of the largest states in the Union, known again as New York State. Thus, New York, New York.
So, Jeff tells me it also happens to be one of the cities that has overcome everything from the horrific 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in 2001 to a devastating pandemic that swept through in early 2020 that has left close to 50,000 people dead so far in New York State alone, and more than 700,000 dead so far across the United States. More Americans have died in the last 19 months in the US than had died in World War II, the Vietnam War, Gulf War I, and Gulf War II. Jeff Kwenange and his team have just returned from New York City after nearly 2 years away. It may be the same New York City, but there's something different about the city that many here swore never sleeps. A city slowly.
Welcome to Times Square, the heart of New York City. You know, someone once said, this is a city that never sleeps.
We were last here in New York City 2 years ago when Kenya was campaigning for a temporary rotational seat on the 15-member United Nations Security Council. That was in November 2019. New York City was an endless cacophony of sights and sounds, endemic traffic everywhere, equally maddening crowds wherever we went. It looked and felt like we were on another planet, with life constantly in the fast lane. No one here could have predicted that a deadly virus was at that time sweeping across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans from China. A virus that would end up causing death, disease, despair, and human destruction on a scale unseen in more than a century. The first signs of COVID-19 started appearing in March 2020, and after that, it was wave after wave after wave. New Yorkers started getting sick. Many rushed to hospitals. Many more sought medication. Many stayed at home. And many more started dying. ICUs became full. Doctors went into panic mode. Nurses and other frontline workers started dying after coming into contact with those infected by the virus. It was a pandemic unseen in literally 100 years. The last time a pandemic of this magnitude swept across the planet was back in 1918. They called it the Spanish flu, and by the time it was finally tamed, more than 50 million people across the world had lost their lives.
What a difference 2 years makes. I'm standing here at Times Square, right in Midtown Manhattan, one of the biggest tourist attractions. Now, 2 years ago when we were last here, this was jam-packed with people. You couldn't find a place to move. 2 years later, the crowds aren't quite there. The mood, not really there. And the tourists simply haven't started coming back in numbers. It looks like COVID-19 has taken a big bite out of the Big Apple.
2 years after the COVID-19 pandemic announced itself, New Yorkers are still coming to terms with the new normal. New York City is having a hard time picking itself from the ground up. Hundreds of bars and restaurants have been closed, retail shops have folded, and a city that was famous for its Broadway and off-Broadway musicals is a shadow of what it once was.
Now, anyone who is familiar with New York City knows that 42nd Street, where I'm standing right now, is one of its most famous addresses. Tourists on any given day would have jam-packed these streets, the retail stores packed to the rafters. But since COVID-19, a lot of these shops have shut down, and many of them have even relocated.
Chris Olepetet has been a resident of New York City for the last 45 years. He left his native Kajiado back in 1976 and came here to settle in the big city. New York, to him, is home. When COVID first struck New York City in March 2020, Olepetet was one of its first victims. He checked himself into a hospital and would end up spending the next 3 weeks there, most of it in ICU.
I went through hell. And not just me, the whole city. The doctors, of course, were scared of sick people. They didn't want to get sick themselves. The hospitals were overwhelmed. So it was really a very trying time. All these cities that you see here, the streets were empty. Nothing but ambulances, fire department, and police.
At one point, Olepetet thought he was going to die, as the healthcare system in one of the world's most advanced nations was on the verge of collapse.
I mean, imagine the city of New York, you are all storming ground. You can never imagine without people. There were no people. Empty avenues and streets. It's just coming back now. It was really bad.
Coming back slowly and painfully. 50,000 deaths later in New York State alone, and hospitals overwhelmed with COVID patients, a vaccine was finally made available and was rolled out in massive numbers. The Pfizer-Moderna vaccine and later the Johnson & Johnson vaccine proved effective, and the pandemic was put in check. New Yorkers breathed a collective sigh of relief, but only for a short while, as a new variant known as Delta, a deadly mutation of the original virus, suddenly appeared, and with it came more death and despair. Vaccinations became mandatory in states like New York, although it wasn't the same in other states across the country. Olepetet was one of the first to be fully vaccinated, and with a further third booster shot, he's urging his fellow Americans and Kenyans to get vaccinated.
I thought I'd never make it, but I wasn't afraid. That's the funny part. You know, it was, whatever happens, happens. It's beyond you at that time. You start hallucinating, that kind of things, you know. Yeah, it's a bad disease. I'll tell my Kenyan people, please get vaccinated if you can. You don't want to go there. If you value your life, take the vaccine. Otherwise, you're dumping your life in a dustbin.
The city planners here have come up with a unique way to open up the city to both local and foreign tourists.
Now, unlike in Kenya or the rest of Africa, where you have to literally walk into a clinic or hospital to get tested for COVID-19, over here, it's the exact opposite. The clinic comes to you literally in the streets. And here's the best part. It's all free.
Dwight and Suzanne Frent have come all the way from Seattle, Washington on the West Coast to attend a function. They've both been fully vaccinated, but New York rules require they still be tested if attending any local events involving crowds.
We're going to an event tonight that requires a current test, because even with the vaccination, I could still have Delta. So by the testing, they can find out whether I'm carrying it even if I don't show any symptoms.
Group event tonight, which will be the first time we've been to a group event, requires vaccination proof and ID to get in the door and a current day COVID negative test.
It is the law throughout the city. No proof of vaccination, no entry, no exceptions.
I think it's going to wind up being like the typical every year shot, because this is not the end of the game. There's going to be this thing, eventually maybe will settle down, but it's not going to be over. It's not ever going to be over.
We decide to test the new normal ourselves, since we'll be leaving New York in a couple of days and need to be tested in order to fly out of JFK. The mobile COVID-19 clinics are spread out all over the city, and it's easy to find one on most street corners. We inquire about the requirements, are given a QR code which contains information needed to fill out an e-form, which we do in minutes. And before you know it, we are being tested for COVID-19 right in the middle of New York City. The test takes minutes, and the results are emailed in 24 hours. Now, statistics show that so far, more than 60% of those living in the West have already been vaccinated. Compare that to Africa, where the number of those vaccinated so far is a pathetic 3.5%. This inequality is what makes some African leaders refer to what's happening around the globe as vaccine apartheid.
It has been vaccine apartheid. How can you call it anything other when you have countries, developed countries, owners of the vaccine, owners of the factories, hoarding, injecting their people not only with just the 2 injections, but also moving to inject a third booster injection. And yet most of our countries are well below 5% who have received even 1 single dose. So you can call it what you want, but basically that is denying billions of people access. And I think when you go by exclusion, you can call it exclusion, you can call it apartheid, but it all means ultimately the same thing.
There's this discussion about, gee, the rich world is hogging all the shots. We felt a little weird about getting a 3rd shot when they could have gone to Africa, but the shots were already at the drugstore, they were going to go to waste. So, but we should be sharing a whole lot more.
Sharing and caring, 2 words that seem worlds apart when it comes to dealing with the greatest threat to humanity in the last 100 years. Jeff Koinange, Citizen Television, New York, New York.